Today at Baja Kits, we have a 2022 Bronco in the shop for our long travel kit. We're going to show you everything you need to install this kit on your truck. This truck is actually going to get a custom set of anodized upper control arms. As you can see, our arms do not come in pink, they come in black and silver. But this customer, she wanted custom pink ones. Then we're going to go on to our lower control arms, and then paired with our extended axles, extended steering and brake lines. And to pair this whole kit together, we're actually installing our King coilovers on this truck, and then another add-on would be our Alcon big brake package on the front. Start our Prerunner install. We're actually going to take off the brake line and ABS line so that it's moving freely and it doesn't get tugged on. Just like that. So after we remove that, we can start to get on to removing most of the lower control arm and steering bolts. So after those bolts are removed, we can move on to the upper control arm bolt. And we're just actually going to take off all these nuts so that we can get everything loose and start to remove it. So now we're going to move on to our axle nut, and it's going to be a 36mm socket. So now we can take off our caliper. It's just going to be two 18mm bolts on the side of the spindle. We're actually just going to remove these caliper bolts on the back side. They're an 18mm socket, and we can just impact those right off. So we're actually going to remove these ABS clips from the actual brake line bracket that was connected to the spindle, so then we can hang this caliper up. We got our caliper hanger right here that we're going to use to hang the caliper on the side of the frame until we put these Alcons on. Once our caliper's off, we can actually just remove our rotor. Once the caliper, all these upper control arm, the tie rod, the sway bar nut is all off, the spindle is just going to be suspended here. But before you knock this ball joint out, you're actually going to want to loosen these upper pivot bolts, and it's going to be a 21mm and a 24mm, just so that it's not under tension, and when it comes off, it doesn't swing up. Once that upper pivot bolt is actually loose, you can actually strike the upright right here to knock this ball joint loose. So just like the upper control arm, we're going to actually strike the upright right here, being careful not to actually damage our boot on our tie rod, and that should knock loose. So now that our spindle is free, all but the lower control arm, we're actually going to get a punch, as you can see, and we're going to actually strike the axle to knock it loose from the hub. So once that axle's been hit, it should be able to just slide right out. It's very important that you use a punch, ensuring that you do not mess up the threads, because your axle nut actually will not go on. If you hit that with a hammer, it will mushroom the actual threads of the axle, and you won't be able to get a nut on there. Going to unbolt the actual upright from the lower control arm, and it's going to be a 21mm nut. And then we're just going to leave it finger tight. It makes it much easier because we're actually going to strike the actual upright so it knocks loose from the lower control arm, and we don't want this to hit the ground when it comes loose. So you're actually going to get to a point where the lower control arm and the axles won't come out without removing the sway bar. You have to actually remove the whole entire sway bar to get the lower control arm pivot bolts out right here. So we're just going to go ahead and get underneath the vehicle and remove the sway bar. We're actually just going to remove these two 15mm bolts and one on the other side. So just a quick note on your Badlands and Sasquatch packages, you're actually going to have this disconnectable sway bar unit right here. So on your Outer Banks and your base models, you're actually not going to have this in there, so it makes it much easier. Our vehicle we're working on today is actually a Badlands Sasquatch package, so we're actually just going to remove these clips and harness so that we can drop this unit out of the way. Now that our sway bar is removed, we can actually lower the vehicle back down and we can start to get at the axle and the lower control arm. Now we can remove our axle, and you can actually just give this a few good tugs and it should pop right out of that front diff. In order for us to get this upper pivot bolt out of the upper control arm, we actually need to pull the steering shaft out of the way. So behind this inner fender well, you're gonna see a 10mm bolt. You're just gonna remove that, slide that upper steering shaft out of the lower, and it should fall down and get you access to pull out the pivot bolt. Now that the steering shaft is out of the way, we can fully remove our upper control arm pivot bolt. So now that our upper control arm is out of the way, we're actually going to loosen up these pivots on the lower control arm so we can drop that down. Then we can move on to our coilover top hat nuts. It's going to be 3 15mm nuts on top, and we can go ahead and remove those, and it should drop the lower control arm and the coilover together. Now that these 3 nuts are removed off of the top hat of the coilover, you can actually push this down. But what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to keep a hand on this, because this is under tension, so it might swing out and hit you. Being careful to put a hand on the actual coilover as you push it down. Once our coilover is removed, we can actually just loosen up these pivot bolts on the lower control arm, remove them, and pull the lower control arm out. There's actually steering stops on the factory uprights that we're going to need to get rid of because our arm is larger and it utilizes that uniball. It actually contacts with these ears. So we're just got it on the bench right now. We're just going to cut these off and then smooth them out. Now we're gonna move on to throwing our lower control arms into the truck. So you're gonna wanna grab the pivot bolt and just slide it up into those pivot pockets and then slide the bolt in. We're gonna throw in our coilover. We're just gonna slide this up and thread the bolts on the top hat so we can suspend the coilover while everything's still loose. We're gonna put on these top hat nuts and we're gonna leave them loose so we can get everything into the lower control arm and the upper control arm on, and then we can snug them up later. Quick little tip, you can actually clock these lower shock mounts so that they can fit up to your lower control arm a little bit nicer. Now that we have our coilover and our lower control arm on, we actually don't have our nuts on our lower pivots and all of our shock bolts are loose. We're gonna put on our upper control arm, and once we get the spindle on, we can kind of start to tighten everything back up, put the steering shaft back on, but we're gonna first put all the suspension components on loosely and then we'll tighten later. Quick little tip, you're actually gonna wanna throw this bolt through the upper control arm so that when it's up in the car, you don't have to turn these rod ends to clock them so that the bolt slides through nicely. Now that our upper control arms, our lower control arms, and our coilover is all in, we can put this upright back in and start to tighten things up. So we're gonna be starting on the passenger side now. Now the only difference between the passenger and driver side is that actual steering shaft that you have to disconnect to get the upper control arm pivot bolt out. So we're just gonna be doing the same thing on this side as we did to the other side. We're just gonna take off this axle nut and pop it loose. Using our punch and our hammer, we're actually just gonna stick our punch in right here and knock it towards the vehicle, ensuring that we don't damage the threads on the outside. Then we can continue moving on to our lower shock bolts and our upper control arm bolts. All right, and again, like the other side, before we knock this upper control arm loose, you're gonna want to loosen the pivot bolt so it doesn't swing up. Once the nuts are all removed, what you can do is we can go on to removing the caliper. Once the caliper is removed, we can actually start hammering all the points on the upright, so then we can take our components off. Before we remove the caliper, we actually have to take off this 10mm bolt off the upright, so all the lines are loose, so when we take off the caliper, we can hang it on the frame. Once removed, we could just hang our caliper from our frame out of the way so we can keep on moving on. Remove the rotor. At this point, we'll go to the ABS line and we can actually just pop it out and unclip it up here. Hang that around there. So now that we know that everything else is removed, we can go on to these points where we previously had to remove the nuts on the tie rod and the upper control arm, and we can actually just knock it with a hammer, and that'll release the actual ball joint. Just like the upper control arm, we're just gonna knock right here and it will release this outer tie rod. So now that that's all off, we can actually remove last our lower control arm nut, and then as well as give it a hammer, and it should pop this whole upright loose. Even though we pop this axle in with our hammer and punch, it might stick in there. What you're gonna wanna do is just completely hammer it through the upright so it's loose. As you can see, just push that, and then we can pull this upright down. Once the axle's released from the upright and it's just hanging, we can actually give it a hammer on the backside where the lower control arm mounts, and it should just release the upright, and we'll take it to the bench. So now that the upright is off the vehicle, we can go to this axle and give it a tug, and it should pull out of the diff. Now with everything out of the way, we can go back to our upper control arm, fully remove the pivot bolt, and get it out of the way. Now with the upper control arm out of the way, I'm gonna move on to the lower control arm, and I'm actually gonna remove these nuts and cams, but leaving the bolts in, so then the upper control arm is suspended up in there. Now that our lower control arm is loose and is free to swing, we're actually gonna move on to our top hat nuts on our coilover. It's gonna be 3 nuts up top. It's just gonna be a 15mm. So now with everything loose, we can actually put some force on the lower control arm to swing this down. Again, like the other side, you're gonna wanna put a hand on this coilover because it is under tension and you don't want it swinging out and hitting you in the face. Now we can just take these pivot bolts out and remove the lower control arm. Now I'm just gonna go on to the outer tie rod and removing it. Just like the other side, we're gonna actually cut these steering ears off of the upright. Baja Kits' lower control arm is actually larger than stock, so it will contact your arm if you don't trim these off, so you're gonna wanna flatten them out. So now I'm just gonna throw the lower control arm up in there and put these pivot bolts in and let it suspend there. So now that our pivot bolts are in our lower control arm, we're just gonna give it a tighten so it's easy to move. With these snug down, we can actually manipulate the lower control arm while we start to fit the upright, the upper control arm, and the coilover. So with the coilover loosely set in here, what we can do is get a flat blade screwdriver and actually clock the lower shock mount and move the lower control arm up so we can actually get it to line up. Just like the other side, I'm gonna use the pivot bolt to line up the rod ends so that it's easier to slide this bolt up through on installation. This guy up in here. Just like the lower control arm, we're gonna snug up the upper control arm so then we can move it out of our way. We can actually throw these shock bolts in and tighten these up now that it's all lined up. So we have bled the brake, everything's bolted, checked. So now we're gonna throw the wheels on. We actually went with Method race wheels and BF Goodrich 37-inch tires. One thing to note with this wheel and tire package is the actual King reservoir mount. You're gonna wanna push it as far away from the wheel well as you can to get extra room. With these kits, they shouldn't touch the reservoir, but we've seen problems of them actually touching right here. We're just gonna move that resi mount as far away from the wheel well as possible and then throw these wheels on. That wraps up our Bronco install. We're gonna get it off the lift, take it over to alignment, and it's all done.